Well, hello, welcome you all to another wonderful opportunity where we get to experience the Word of God just a little bit at a time. Hey, I am Reverend Charles Nelson, and I'm excited to be here with you today with the Tuesday Talks with the Teacher. And we had slated for us a guest. I know some seen the flyer and the things that was related to that. But we know life gets to life, and sometimes things happen that makes those things that interrupt something, but we are seasons that we can continue to move forward. It tells us in the Word of God to be instant in season and out of season. Now, I know in the context of what it's talking about, but sometimes we have to be prepared, even in these types of spaces as well, just to continue to move forward when things may not be going the way that we will project for them to go. I'm looking at my screens because I'm seeing some lagging and some dragging. And so we're going to be paying some close attention. As you can see, I am not in my regular or typical space this morning. Let me see here. I'm going to see if I can clean my camera, get a better view. Makes it look a little bit better here. All right, that looks a little bit better. Let's see here. So this past Sunday, we did our sermonic presentation. It came out of the Second Chronicles chapter 5, dealing with a key area passage from verses number 11 through 14. I looked through it, and in some translation, it has it broken down into many different instances. But one of the things I did come to realize throughout some of my study is that it showed it in some of the more original language, going back into some of that stuff, that it was all one sentence. Verses 11 through 14 was all one sentence. And so that's what really helped guide and direct my thoughts and things that was along with that. And I'm going to pull it up. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen. I think there was, let's see here. No, I don't want the ticker version. I want the regular. What happens? Let's see here. Just give me a moment. I made it so we could put it on the screen. But now, of course, when I need it, I can't find it. So just look at the ticker down at the bottom. As a matter of fact, we'll just put it right there. Look, this very first one, it says, and when the priest came out of the holy place, for all the priests who were present had consecrated themselves without regards to their division. Verse number 12, it goes in and it says, and all the Levitical singers, Asaph, Heman, and I always mess up this name, but it's Jeduthun, or something of that, Jeduthun, their sons and kinsmen, arrayed in fine linen with cymbals, harps, and lyres, stood east of the altar with 120 priests. Here's verse number 13. And it was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to make themselves heard in unison in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised, and now where is my verse 14? Oh, here. Okay. With their trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. And here's the heart. Oh, made it go away. Here's the meat of it here. The house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. Hey, without going through all the logistics of all of my studying, there's a lot that is written here. The writer, he uses a structure where he begins on one side, and it kind of comes up to a climax. His main point becomes this climax. And when I began to realize that here, it was right there in that last portion that we just read that allowed me to know that this was the climax was the house of the Lord was filled. The house of the Lord was filled. And it wasn't just filled with anything. It was filled with a cloud. This cloud, it had so much in with it. We're going to deal with that a little bit later. But look, it had even an impact that it says in verse 14, so that, in other words, what this is also saying unto us, the house being filled, the Lord's house being filled with this cloud, it had an impact. This is what happened when the house was filled with this cloud, that the priests could not stand. They could not stand. What? But not even stand, but they couldn't even stand with the purpose to minister. Why? Because of the cloud. And then it has this fourth statement. And what it allows us to be able to see, this is the reason why they could not stand. It almost as if it's saying the house was filled with a cloud, gives you this what happens, but it gives you, and then it goes right back. And it returns right back to that about this cloud that filled the house, but it gives us additional information about this cloud. It says, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. And so we allows us to be able to see with the at this climactic point that the house of the Lord was filled with God's presence. And so and we worked through that, and the sermon title was When It Happens, and that it is when God fills his house with his glory, and we could see what took place and happened there. And so we just want to just spend a little bit of time, and we're going to walk through some things, give some additional background and information that is pertaining and related to this wonderful and beautiful text. Let me go ahead and take that ticker down. All right. I'm going to check a couple of different things real quick. There we go. That looks a little bit better. I like that a little bit better there. All right. And so let's go ahead. Let's move a little bit further here. Let's do that. All right. And so let us now move a little bit further along with this study. We're always encouraging you to be able to chime in and leave your comments and walk with me through this situation. We want to have some questions and things. If you're on at the, we're at 1 o'clock. I know we were supposed to be on at noon, but we are on at 1 o'clock. And for those that are on with us live, we could definitely have this interaction here. One of the first things I began to realize, oh, come on now. It's technology. I think there's something wrong with it. There we go. Maybe. Yeah, because it's been a little bit, so we're going to pay attention to that there. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the big picture of First and Second Chronicles. This big picture, what is the significance of these two books in God's story? When we arrive at the Bible, yes, we may be able to find information there that can help transform our lives on how we live on earth. We may hear some great and wonderful stories about points in history of things that have happened. But ultimately, this is God's story, and he utilizes his word to reveal himself unto us. And in First and Second Chronicles, he does this very thing. Chronicles is a retelling of the children of Israel, of their history after they came out of exile. This would have been after they had been under the Egyptian bondage. This would have been after they would have dealt with some of the different things with going through the wilderness. This would have been after the death of Moses. This would have been after the time of Joshua and his leadership. This would have been after the time when they had, after Joshua died, that they went through a season of having judges. This would have been after all of these things, as his and we enter into these books, the first and second Chronicles, as it shows us and reminds. It was a reminder to the children of Israel of God and how his interaction with them as his people, as God being their identity, as if there is being rooted not so much in their obedience, and their identity was not so much wrapped up in what they had to offer, but their identity was rooted in God's covenant with them. It begins to show that even though they had failures, their covenant was was rooted in God's faithfulness. And so even though they had failures in their life, God still remained faithful. And Chronicles, the first and second Chronicles, is history with hope. It is written to people who have lost everything, but yet reminding them that God's promise never expires. And so another thing I want to be able to realize is that we have other books written around this same time that is retelling this same story, some of the same stories. And so one of the things I wanted to be able to ask is, how does Chronicles differ from Kings and Samuel? This is some good things to be able to know. Whereas Kings shows why exile happened. This would have been when they fall into the Babylonian and this other captivity. He said Kings show why it happened. It focuses on the children of Israel, their failure and their disobedience. But Chronicles look back through the lens of hope. It focuses on David's line. It focuses on the temple. Its focus is on God's covenant. And so we can see that these are some differences that is there. And so this book, it begins to reveal some things about God. First of all, it reveals God's faithfulness. It shows us that God is a keeping God. Yes, we get shouted, and we'll shout from on high when we hear the preacher talking about how God has kept us from danger seen and unseen, how he has kept us throughout the night, how he has kept us with a reasonable portion and strength and health. But when we read through Chronicles, we could shout for all those reasons, but we also come to the realization that he is a covenant keeping God, that he is a covenant keeping God. When I let me see here, I'm gonna pull it on up, and we're going to talk about that just very, very briefly. What does that mean for God to be a covenant keeping God? I see there is some people that is watching on the different platforms that you could definitely find or utilize this time to be able to. What is your thoughts? What does it mean for God to be a covenant keeping God? What does that mean? I'm going to begin, but I'm going to be looking to see if we have any thoughts that have come from the comment section. When we think about God being a covenant keeping God, we first have to realize that what is this covenant? What is this covenant that we are speaking of? When we start talking about the word covenant, it can basically, on a basic level, it is a binding agreement or a committed relationship between two parties. It is often sealed by promises, obligations, and different signs. In scriptures, we have two different types of covenants. And we see them as being sacred commitments that is initiated and upheld by God. When we begin to look at these things, we can see that there is implications of covenants as it was sealed by blood. Hold up, this even takes us back. I remember when I was a child, before we had some of these other diseases like AIDS and HIV and COVID and all those things. They had a term that was called blood brothers. Blood brothers was purposely for the intent maybe of those that did not have a brotherly relationship, as in a sense they shared the same mother or the same father, but it was two individuals that were so close in their friendship that they was the friends that stuck closer than a brother, and they would seal it typically with cutting of their blood or pricking their fingers, so that on one hand they'll do it with one, the other one would do it as well, and they would touch those bloods or they would shake those cut hands together, and this would be the sign of the commitment. This would be a covenant. This would be the binding agreement. And when we think about covenants in the Old Testament, when we think about these things, it is in the same quality of covenant. There are, I said earlier, there was two different types of covenants. There was one in particular. Let me see here. I'm trying to find my notes here, as I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But there was two different types of covenants. One type of covenant was conditional covenants. These were covenants that had mutual agreements. We see it even implemented as we read through some of the stories or some of the history of the Chronicles. You remember what it says in First Chronicles chapter. I can't even think of the place location right now. But when he says, if my people who are called by my name will, and he gives them this list of things they ought to do. He begins with this, if you do this, and then what's the promise there? He says, then I will hear from heaven. I will heal your land. And so we see these types of covenants that if you do this, if we on here on earth do our part, then God will move and do his part. We see it in the Mosaic. He says, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession. That's in Exodus chapter 19. Here we are when we look about this type of covenant. We realize is that our blessings is tied to our obedience, and equally so. If blessings is tied to our obedience, that means there is something also tied to our disobedience, and that is the opposite of blessing. Those curses, but those non-blessed items that we align ourselves up with when we are disobedient. Here it is. Conditional covenant shows us needs because it keeps God's law without God's grace. We need these conditional covenants, but then we have unconditional covenants. Unconditional covenants are based on God's promise alone. God is the one who binds himself to these things, regardless of human failure. These types of covenants, they don't depend on human action, but they depend on God's faithfulness. Here's a few different ones. He gave an unconditional covenant to Noah after the flood. He made the agreement that he would never flood the whole earth or destroy the whole earth again by flood. He did a covenant, unconditional covenant with Abraham. We could read it in Genesis chapter 12. We could read it in Genesis chapter 15, where God he made a promise that his descendants would have, that Abraham would have descendants, that it would have land, and that he would be a blessing to all nations. These were things that were not based on Abraham's obedience, but about God's promise alone. But then there was also, like even with David's covenant, the Davidic covenant, I should call it, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see that there is a promise that is given to David about someone from his descendants that would sit on the throne. And we see that being fulfilled in the life of Christ. And so we can see here that when unconditional covenants, it is God making a guaranteed promise even with himself, which is different when God is prepared to bless us based on our obedience. And even in the life of the believer today, there is some unconditional covenants or unconditional promises of God that we have. But there is also some conditional promises as well, where if we do this, God will be willing to do that, so to speak. And when we see these things, we see that they come into this great fulfillment with this new covenant that is both unconditional, as we look at God's grace through his blood, through the blood of Jesus Christ, but also it is conditional that we must respond in faith and we must respond with faith. And in Jesus, we could really see that God keeps every covenant promise and he does it perfectly. And so I just we kind of rabbit trailed off of some of my notes, but I thought it was definitely vital and important that we take some time and look at these things, this covenant language, because this is the things that are vital even in this aspect here as we are dealing with these things. And in First and Second Chronicles, this is a book that is showing that God is faithful to keep his covenant, that he is a holy God and he demands purity. We also reveals that God's presence as he chooses to dwell among his people. Here it is, how this could be related and helpful for us. When we are dealing with seasons of loss, when we are going through seasons of rebuilding, we do not need to be bottled down and get weary and well-doing, but we need to be reminded that God is not finished writing his story with us. And so we talked about what that is, that big picture of First and Second Chronicles. If you are live, you could definitely let me know if that is helpful or beneficial unto you. But then secondly, let's look at the occasion of Second Chronicles and this 5th chapter, where we have found our message for this weekend and the true context of the area where we are, what is bringing us about with this talk with the teacher on this Tuesday. The occasion. What I said, when I was studying this out, I said, well, what was different about this time? What is why, I guess I should say, why was this dedication different? Well, here's the answer that I got, or what I could just sum it up in these couple of sentences here. It wasn't just about another gathering. It marked the fulfillment of God's promise to David and the arrival of his glory in the temple. This made me really just sit down and contemplate that, because sometimes we come into church on Sunday and we just treat it like another gathering. We enter into seasons, or we see how God is moving in our lives, but then there are moments where God fulfills his promise in our lives. And we cannot treat it as just another gathering, but we must be able to see the uniqueness of what God is doing. There was something that not only made this dedication different, but it also made it unique in the sense of it showed us a unified front with Israel. We hear about the harmony of the music and worship and God's visible glory that is even with the cloud. This was the first time that we began to see God's permanent dwelling as it was established with his people. All of the people, the priests, the Levites, and singers, they were united in worship. The cloud was so thick and it was so powerful that ministry even stopped. It was both fulfillment of God's promise and a fresh revelation of his presence. When we began to think about that, when God's people sung with one voice, his glory had a way of showing up. And I don't know about you, but I want God to show up in some areas in my life. What areas in your life do you need God to show up in? And when you start to think about that, what are you doing to be united? It says when God's people sing with one voice, his glory has a way of showing up. And I believe there is some individual ways where we need God to show up in our lives, but are we singing on with one voice with God? Are we asking God to bless our finances, but we are still spending more money on gambling, more money that we are wasting away? We're spending more money on in the liquor store. We're spending more money with the weed man, with the drug dealers. Are we spending more money and foolish and unorthodox? Are we spending more money building our own house rather than we are building with the house of God? Hold on. Are we willing to sing? I never put it to you like this. If our money can sing, would it be singing on one voice with God? The quality of how we spend our lives, would it be singing one voice with God? Or would it be a song that is marching to our own beat? If we want God to show up in ways and areas in our lives, we must begin by questioning the quality of the voice that we are singing with. But then not only individually, as this text deals with it corporally. Are we coming into church on Sunday with division among us? Are we coming into church on Sunday trying to see who we can outshine, outshow, or are we willing to be a people that is willing to sing with one voice? God still inhabits the praises of his people. And when we sing together, the Spirit has an opportunity to make our worship more than just another gathering. It is every time we come into worship, it is an opportunity to live in the presence of a living God. So that our worship should be less about our style, but more about seeking God's presence together in unity. A dear brother of mine, we were just talking about this last night, that we are satisfied because we have style. We're satisfied in that moment, but are we truly seeking God? Are you settled with style by the way things look, or are you seeking God's presence? And if you are seeking God's presence, what things are you willing to lay down so that you in your worship experience can see God's presence together in unity. Let's keep on moving forward. I don't want to say right there's a whole lot that we could say with right there. But that really brings us, kind of lays down this occasion as it was coming about. This temple had finally been built. The Ark of the Covenant, God was coming along, and this was a day that was not going to be like any other day. But then not only do we see those things, here's something that I also wanted to be able to ask. How do we serve God while we are waiting? When I began to think about this, when we read it's a scripture like in First Chronicles chapter 17, when we get up on it in chapter 22 and chapter 28, we see that David wanted to build the temple. But God said, no, not right now. That's not your responsibility. But what I like about David, he didn't just get frustrated. He didn't run away from serving. He didn't throw in the towel with God. But he realized that God had said no for a reason and a purpose. And despite God saying no, David still did the work to prepare Solomon. How to do so? He did so by gathering material. He began to organize worship, and he drew out the blueprints. And this should be able to help us to be able to know that even when God says no to what we cannot do, he can still say yes to some plans that we can help someone else to be able to accomplish what he has said no unto us. And that is so vital and important for especially church leaders. That is important for us as leaders within our home. Because look, in the reality of it, God didn't choose another congregation to do what he said no to David to. He chose his son. And sometimes he may choose somebody very close to us to be able to do some things that we've been wanting to do. But are we going to become bitter? Are we going to become filled with envy and jealousy? Or will we be willing to move humbly and walk with him on what God's plan is? Let's move right along. When I begin to think about this, serving God while we are waiting, that we can realize that we can still prepare, we can still organize, and we can still be an encouragement to the one that God does want to use. Maybe sometimes it's not that God is showing us things so that we could be at the forefront, but maybe God is showing us so that we can play the supporting roles. And so sometimes God's no is not a rejection, it's a redirection. And so when we think about that today, we must serve faithfully in preparation and knowing that our serving is just as valuable as doing the final work. What has God said no to in your life, or said not right now in this situation that you're dealing with, but yet you still have ways to contribute faithfully? Are you withholding your contributions? And I'm not just talking about financial contributions. Are you holding back because you're not the name on the program? Are you holding back because it's not at your church? Are you holding back because you don't get to sit in the big seat? Well, I want to just be able to challenge us today to put on our big boy pants and serve God where he wants us to serve. And maybe your supporting role is more valuable than the role itself. I'm gonna just just pause right here and let me see where I'm looking at on time, because I do want to honor it. We got about 15 more minutes here, and but I just want to pause right here. I'm reminded in this moment, like my mother, she majority of her career, she worked in management positions within the restaurant industry, and so she always wherever she was at, she was always quickly promoted up into these supporting roles. For her latter years, she was a assistant manager for several of the Panera Breads in our city. I mean, they will use her in one, and then they will notice that there was another place that may have been struggling with meeting their labor. They had these rules where they wanted to keep labor at a certain percentage of the money that was coming in. And my mother just happened to be almost an expert of being able to help meet those type of quotas. She will be an expert when it came down to managing waste control. She will be an expert in several different areas in those ways and lives. And so whenever they saw a need, and we probably got about 10 to 12 different Panera Breads here, and there has probably only been a couple of that she hadn't had a chance to work in her lifetime before she made her transition to be with the Lord. But I remember there was a time when they asked her to become a store manager, and she denied that opportunity. She said no, because she knows that she was not ready and not even willing to make the problems her own. She said, I don't want the problem to be mine, but I help anybody else who that problem is to be able to help them out. And I just tell you that to be able to say, sometimes God sees that we may not be the one to be able to handle the problem, but he wants to use us in these supporting roles to help the person who he has laid that weight on so that they can move it forward. We have to be able to know how to serve while we are waiting on God to move in these different areas of our lives. So don't let, when God says no or not now, to be a rejection, but look for God's redirection. And so here's another point that I want to really talk about and see here. I'm looking through them because I still got more talk than I do time. So let's see here. So we may be breezing along pretty quickly here with these next ones. I had to ask this question that I really want you to reflect on as well. What are some of the challenges that come along with serving God? We just talked about that. Sometimes what makes it a challenge because we know what we want to do, but it's met by a no by God or a redirection from God. But what are some other things that come into play? I'm thinking about David. Like, what are some other ways he could have responded? He could have allowed pride or his own arrogance to. I ain't saying that he had arrogance, but those are something he could have moved in those ways. He could have been. He could have been. What's the word I'm looking for? He could have felt rejection. Like David, almost in a sense, even as I'm thinking about this, David could have had to deal with feeling rejected. Why do you say that? I'm so glad you asked. Remember when, for those of us that do know the Bible, and for those that don't, when David became anointed as king, he was serving in his human father's house, and God had showed into Solomon that there was a king that he needed to anoint. Not that they wasn't going to become the king at that moment, but the king was in his future. When Solomon went to David's father's house, David's father brought in all of his brothers, and none of them was the one. And it almost as if he almost forgot about David serving out in the fields. It's, oh yeah, I do got this one other son out here. He's serving. He said, go get him. And when David showed up, God revealed that he's the one that I want to use. He's the one I'm looking for. But I'm saying that to be able to say, can you imagine being the, oh yeah, there's him in your father's house? What kind of rejection that had to, he had to deal with a lot of this stuff when he began to get, his name began to gain clout, even under King Saul's rulership. People was admiring him more. He could have easily allowed pride and became big-headed, allowed that to move in as he would go through that, but he didn't. You know, but what does that even look like for us? Sometimes serving God becomes a challenge because we have so many that have denied their opportunity to serve, that the ones that are serving can encounter burnout. We can encounter burnout. We can encounter distractions. Sometimes we begin to play this comparison game, and we see what God is doing in other places or in other ministries, and we compare ourselves to others. Sometimes we compare ourselves not because they are doing well or doing better or seem to have a better grip on it. Sometimes our comparison is with someone that is less or that maybe not as effective with us. Maybe we're comparing ourselves with those that do not show up, and we're saying, well, at least I'm doing this. And all these things, they come along with division. They start drawing these lines as we seek to serve God's purpose in our generation. Here it is. One of the things we must be able to do is we must learn how to overcome these different challenges. How do we do that? We must rely and rest on God's strength. We must stay humble and keep our eyes on Jesus. And we must be willing to work together. The enemy doesn't have to stop our serving. He just has to sour our spirit. And when we think about that, I want you to really ponder, like, which of these challenges do you face most often? Or what challenge, if it ain't one of these ones that have been mentioned, pride, burnout, jealousy, distractions, comparison to division, what is it that you face most often? And how can you purify your motives this week? As we continue to move forward with these last 10 minutes here, we must be able to realize that also we must be dealing right where we just ended off at. Because speaking of purity, 2 Chronicles chapter 5, it tells us that the priests sanctified themselves before they were serving. And when I began to think about that, here's the question that I have with that. Here's the questions that I do have with that. What does it mean to be sanctified? And what are the dangers of trying to serve without being sanctified? Sanctification, it literally means to be set apart. To be sanctified, it means to be cleansed and made holy for God's use. For us as believers, we have the moment of sanctification when we walk into our salvation. At that moment, when we are saved, we have been set apart. We have been cleansed from the penalty of our sins, and we have been put in a position to be used by God. Then we also have the process of sanctification that is constantly setting us apart, that is constantly cleansing us from the power of sin. And it is constantly preparing us to be used more and more for God's use. But when we try to serve God without being sanctified, I will use language from Leviticus chapter 10, we become a strange fire. We become people who serve and we become hypocrites. We face a bigger risk of running into things like burnout, being distracted, and ultimately we may be doing a lot of work, but our service is dishonoring God. So the right activity with the wrong heart is still the wrong offering unto a sovereign God. We may be doing the right things, but if we have a wrong heart, it is just as bad, and it is still the wrong offering unto God. And so we see here that the priests, the Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 that they sanctified themselves. So before serving, pause, ask this question: am I offering God clean hands and a pure heart? But when we are purified, purity invites God's presence where impurity hinders it. But listen here, purity not only invites God's presence, but it is an opportunity for it to lead to unity. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, the unity in diversity. In Chronicles chapter 5, the priests, the Levites, the singer, all had different roles, yet they moved together. And so my question then becomes for this portion right here, what can we learn? What can we learn about moving in unity while yet being different? This is a topic that is one of those hot button topics over the church, even over our country right now, even over our world. But we see here that the priests, the Levites, the musicians, the singers, they all had different roles, but they all had one goal. They were able to function like a body of many parts. Unity does not mean uniformity, but unity means we have harmony. Today's church, we can overcome cultural, political, generational, and gifting that is different by focusing on Christ as the center. There is a space for each of our culturals and all of these different things to live, as long as we are focusing on Christ as the center. Then the ultimate question then becomes, how can we use our gift to be a contribution to the church, to the upbuilding and upkeeping of the kingdom without competing with others? Let's see where I'm at on time. I'm right at my time, but there is still just one more thing I want to be able to attack and address here, because there's a great question here about this cloud and this glory. We know that there's unity and diversity, and when the church unite, something begins to happen. When we put our big eyes aside, it leaves room for God to do something. And here in the text, It shows us that this is when God's glory was revealed, when they were purified, when they were unified, and when they were praising God. God was able to move forward. And this is when it happens. What was it that happened? The cloud filled the house. And so dealing with this cloud, I just had the question of what is this cloud and what is its significance? This cloud, it represents a visible sign of God's dwelling presence. Some may even call it the Shekinah glory of God. We see it time and time again throughout scripture. In Exodus chapter 40, we see it in 1 Kings chapter 8. We see it in Isaiah chapter 6, where this cloud just appears and it reveals God's sign of his dwelling presence. And there is some times and seasons and ways that God just shows up and gives us a visible sign that he is with us. But not only are we dealing with this cloud that is here, but we also see God's glory. What is God's glory? In simple terms, God's glory is the manifestation of his holiness, his uniqueness, his set asideness, his differentness, his unlike no one else. It is the manifestation, it is the revealing, it is the showing forth, it is the aha moment of God's majesty. It is the manifestation. It is when it shows itself forth of God's presence. We see this as we hear about Jesus, is God's glory revealed when we read through John chapter 1. We see this, that it is the Spirit that fills the believers in Acts chapter 2. We see God's glory revealed when we are transformed in his glory. And as we read that in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the glory that once filled the temple is now the same glory that wants to fill God's people. But we must know and realize that we have some responsibilities individually and corporately if we want to be this dwelling place, and we must be able to do so. So the question then becomes, are we living as temples where God's glory can be seen by others? Are we purifying our temples personally so God can utilize what he has in us? Are we united with God's vision with our own individual lives? Are we willing to lock arms with God and seek him out and sing praises unto him, regardless of the season, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of our situations? For God's presence is not predicated it is not based upon our circumstances, situation, but it's based upon his promise. It's based upon his covenant. It's based upon his agreement. And so as I prepare now, we're closing. We're right at an hour of recording. So I think I got about 5 minutes before we actually are dealing with the whole hour of teaching. We want to look at this. Here is something that can help us why we ought to praise God, why we ought to set ourselves off in this sense. Why even not only us individually, but us collectively, how can we move purified? How can we move in unison? How can we, and I don't want to say how, but why, I should say, my fault, why we should move purified, why we should move unified, why should we move as people that praise the Lord? Well, Let's look at this word glory. And we're going to break it down and use that as an acronym as I seek to close off our live this afternoon. First of all, G, we must realize the greatness of God's presence. The greatness of God's presence. I was looking for it. I had some extra notes that was there. But not only do we see the greatness of God's presence, when we must recognize the greatness of God's presence, that He is, He is bigger than us, and He is greater than us all. But also L, the love that endures forever. His covenant love holds us together. But then the O, oneness of God's people, the unity, despite being diverse, brings God's glory down. We can live in unity, but yet still be diverse. I don't have to deny who I am. I don't have to deny my life experiences to be united with someone that grew up different than me. R, reverence and worship, that we ought to serve with holiness and the fear of the Lord. And finally, our why, we ought to be yielding to His Spirit. We must take a step back so He can truly fill His house. What house? Us, our temples, His house with His glory. And that's all I have for us here on today. There is just a couple of things, especially for us at Christ Temple Mission Church, that we want to be able to touch on and be able to see here. There is always some great, wonderful opportunities for you to be able to give. You can drop off or mail your offerings to 500 North 25th Street in Lincoln, Nebraska, 68503. Or you also may be able to go to the Breeze Champs app or go to this hyperlink that is there. I'm going to put it in the comments section as well, where you will be able to give your offering there as well. And so we do have those opportunities where you can give. We also have some great, wonderful times that is coming up here. And just give me a moment here. I'm going through and I'm trying to get that placed. All right. And then I think I got it set in there. And so, and then also along with that, there was another way that you can give as well. You can give by sending a text message. Send the word give, GIVE, to this phone number, 402-235-4341. And you can follow those prompts, and that would get you right on in to be able to give even in that way as well. We have our Wednesday night Bible study. We have began this series that we're going to be in for a little while here as we are experiencing, or we're going to be walking through what does it look like after the resurrection, where we'll be looking at the New Testament in chronological order based off the encounters that we see in the Bible. And so we'll be looking at Acts and some of the other letters, the Corinthian letters, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians. We'll be looking at all those different letters as a brief overview as we walk through this time, and we'll be doing so and as we look at it in chronological order. as we are, this is one of the things I just want to take this very brief time. This is a suicide prevention and awareness month. We always want to encourage you, if you are struggling and dealing with some mental capacities in that manner, in that way, you can call 988, which is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, or you can always utilize your local emergency numbers, because we know that these things are real. We want to make sure that you live and that you don't die. Last and not least, as we surely want to encourage you to follow us on YouTube. Follow us on YouTube at CTMC Lincoln, where you will find us there. You could join us and follow us there. We've just recently got that all nice and set up, and so we're looking forward to the growth and being able to minister in that space as well. But here it is. In a few weeks, all roads are going to lead right here to Christ Temple Mission Church, and we welcome you to join us for this pastoral installation service for none other Reverend Charles Nelson and First Lady Minister Shavonda Nelson on October the 19th at 4 p.m. Join us in celebrating what God is doing. So we want to make sure you have opportunity to come out in those manners in that way. And so with that being said, I believe that is it. My humble prayer for you on today is surely may God bless you and may God keep you on this day. Until next time.